Hey everyone, my name's Dom, welcome back to the channel. Today it's time for another book review, and this is going to be the one to kick off my new ongoing series under the banner Under the Radar Reads. These are a series of book reviews for titles that I've not seen on BookTube, and I want to help introduce them to a wider audience. So the first official review in this series is today, so stay tuned to hear more about Blood of Heirs by Alicia Wanstall-Burke. So Blood of Heirs is book one in the Coraidic Sagas, Alicia Wanstall-Burke's self-published fantasy trilogy. This was one of hundreds of titles which was entered into Mark Lawrence's SPFBO, the self-published fantasy blog-off, whereby different reviewers go through a selection process to narrow down to 10 final books that all the reviewers will rate, and then their scores will be aggregated to find a winner. Blood of Heirs got through to that final 10 a couple of years ago. It wasn't the overall winner, but it placed really well out of a total of, I think it was 300 books in that particular year. So it did really well in that competition and therefore comes highly recommended. Book 2 in the series then is Legacy of Ghosts, which is set 4 years after events here in Blood of Heirs. And then Book 3, the final book in the trilogy, is Empire of Shadows, released on the 25th of January 2022. And as it happens, the cover for Book 3 is actually dropped today, so I'm able to share that with you ahead of its release. So as always, I'm going to keep this review as spoiler-free as possible. There are some elements in the book synopsis which could be considered spoilers. I'm happy with those, but I know a lot of people really like to go into the books blind, so I'm going to, as much as possible, avoid touching on those particular aspects that I think are spoilerish concerning events which happen a little bit further along in the storyline, as opposed to just kind of the initial scene setting. So Blood of Heirs has 2 distinct storylines and 2 main characters, one for each of those storylines. The first character we meet is Lidan. She is a 12-year-old girl. She's the eldest daughter of a clan chief, or in fact the eldest offspring of a clan chief, and she's working to officially be named as the heir of the Tolak clan. The chief has 4 wives and 10 daughters, but he hasn't had a son, and it's customary, as in many cultures, for the son to be named as heir. Because the chief doesn't have an heir, Lidan is the de facto heir of the clan, but she hasn't been officially named because the chief is still waiting to see if one of his wives will give him a son. Lidan has a lot to go through because she wants to lead, she wants to earn the respect of her people. She wants to be a ranger like her father, to ride and to fight and to be able to look after the clan and earn their respect through battle and through actual leadership in the field. Her mother has different ideas on the matter and does not want her to go down that path. She wants her to lead through other means, and Lidan has a really hard time kind of bringing herself to see her mother's point of view, because she doesn't understand how she's going to be able to gain the trust and gain the respect of the people and to be able to in the future lead them if she's not able to do that by following in her father's footsteps and becoming a ranger. Our second storyline then follows Ranulf Olseta, or Ran, and he is a little bit older. He's 15 years old at the start of the book, and he is the oldest son and the actual heir in this case, therefore, of the Duke of Orphea. He starts out the book, he's on the front lines, he's given command of a company of troops, and the Orphea and the neighbouring Woden Empire are 2 nations that have been for the longest time at war, and they have constant battle kind of back and forth over this disputed border, and we open Rand's story as he is on the front lines fighting in one of these battles. In many ways he is the same as Lidan. He wants to do a good job, he wants to lead by example and to be the best heir that he can be basically, and to be able to lead and to protect his people as he grows up and actually takes on the mantle, in this instance, of the Duke of Orphea. So in terms of the characters themselves, I really liked the character work here. It's definitely what I would call a character-driven book rather than a plot-driven book. There are definite plot elements as well, of course, but the main focus for me is on the characters here. Starting with Lidan, I really like how we see her motivations and we can see her kind of trying to work things out in her head as to how she's going to accomplish her goal of becoming heir. And also as she's kind of battling with her parents, her father on the one hand who's kind of deferring to her mother's judgment a lot, and her mother who Lidan's not really able to see things from her mother's point of view. In this particular clan, the Tolak clan, one of the chief's wives becomes pregnant, and there are kind of the signs, the auguries if you like, that this one will be a son. So Lidan and her mother are doing everything they can to, before this child is born, to have Lidan officially named as heir to the clan. Once the child is born, if it's a son, then everything could go out the window, because although that child would be the youngest of the chief's children by far, as a son, he might automatically take over the mantle as heir to the clan. Now, as far as Lidan goes, I feel like the storyline doesn't really have too many elements to it. We're dealing primarily with this kind of inner struggle within the family for Lidan to prove her worth, not only to her father and her mother and the rest of the clan, but also in many ways to herself. There are obviously things that happen within this and various complications along the way, and it does lead to a very interesting story, but this half of the book in particular is definitely on the character development side of things, and I think to that effect it does a really good job, because I really like to see her learning new things, learning about herself, putting her determination to the test and coming out on top. And I think it's really well done on the whole when we're looking at those particular scenes. Ran is a slightly different character. He's a little bit older to start with. He already is named as the heir, so his kind of motivations are slightly different, but ultimately they're heading in the same kind of direction as Lidan's are. He's got a very much different storyline, however, because he's actually fighting on front line, so we see him in a different situation to where we see Lidan. There are some ups and downs for Rand. Some things go his way and he's seen as kind of a saviour to his people at one moment, and then in other instances things aren't going his way and he finds himself cast away on his own in the wilderness being hunted down. So certainly for the second part of Rand's storyline, we're looking at him basically trying to stay a step or a few steps ahead of his trackers and essentially fighting to stay alive. There's also some additional elements of Rand's storyline that I won't go into because of the spoiler aspect of them, but these give a really interesting dynamic to his particular character development, and I really like the way that he works his way through them, the choices that he has to make, the people that he meets along the way, both on the, if you like, the kind of good and the bad spectrum for his particular situation. And I like the interactions that he has with them and the new directions that he ends up setting out on as a result of those interactions. So I think Rand's storyline was definitely a little bit more engaging, but both had really good character development and were really interesting, even though with Lidan's story in particular, I didn't feel like there was as much kind of overarching plot. It was very much more self-contained. So we do spend a lot of time in her the Tolak village, but we do move outside of that as well and experience some of the wider world and some of the dangers, some of the challenges that are facing this particular world. Now, as far as the world goes, the story is maybe a little bit odd, because in these tales I generally tend to see you have a couple of different storylines in different places and then at some point they converge, and in this book they don't do that. So we can see kind of overlapping aspects between the two storylines, some of the aforementioned challenges that this world is facing. Both of our characters and the people they're with are facing these same challenges, but we don't actually get to a point where the two storylines are in the same place and the characters are aware of each other or anything along those lines. That may come in book 2, I don't know. However, we don't get that in book 1, and that's fine. I don't feel like we needed to see that. It does make it almost two separate stories, but because we do have those interweaving kind of external influences, we can see that they are linked, and we can see kind of looking forward how they may converge in the future as well. The world itself is quite well planned out, and you do get to see a very different dynamic with the two storylines. So on the one hand, with Ran, you've got maybe a bit more of a civilized culture, to use that word lightly. You've got cities and towns and the wilderness in between the two, basically, as Ran moves around the countryside. Whereas with Lidan, as I say, you spend a lot of the time in the clan life, whether it's with her clan, the Tolak, or when we move on in the story and we start seeing some of the other clans as well, and again the travel in between the two locations. But for her, for the Tolak, it does seem a very much simpler life, and you've got things like metal, for instance, where all the weapons are stone for the most part, and if you've got a metal axe, then it's a sign of wealth because they don't really have the materials and the forges to be able to work with metal, which is why they have stone weaponry, and they're just not familiar with metal weapons. Magic isn't really explored in any great detail in this book, but we do have the existence of magic. So we have one character, for instance, who has magic awakened within them, and because of the way magic is viewed in this world, it's very much feared and actually outlawed for many parts of the world. Because of that, there's no training for this character. There's no kind of mentor figure. There's no spell books or anything along those lines. So the character's very much left to figure things out for themselves, essentially. And it's a little bit weird when you see that in the book, because you see things like there's a scene where this character is in a fight and things seem to be a lost cause, and this character basically imagines a shield between them and their attacker, deflecting blows, for instance. And it's kind of a bit weird because there's no detail to it. So when you read it initially, or when I read it initially, I felt that was a bit basic. But at the same time, there's no training for this character. If I imagine myself put in this character's shoes, if I found that I suddenly had magical powers but I didn't know how to use them, as much as anything, there's been no time to experiment as well, and I'm under attack, I can full well imagine doing exactly what this character did and kind of picturing in my mind what I wanted to happen, and then trusting to faith and ability that it would actually happen. So I thought, whether intentional or not, I thought that was actually quite a clever way of doing it. And I can see the way the storyline progresses, I can see that in book 2, my guess at least is that we will have more on the magic and more of the kind of technicality and the theory of the magic to go along with it. As far as the plot goes, I did enjoy the story. As I say, I felt that certain areas of it didn't really seem to move very far, but I definitely felt that this was more of a developmental book, developmental for the characters, if nothing else. And I know book 2 is set 4 years in the future, so we're dealing with the same characters, but we're skipping an entire 4 years by the time we come to Legacy of Ghosts. So I'm really interested to see what's happened over those 4 years and how things have developed, not only with our characters, but with the events in the world as well. And one of the things I think that will do for me is I'm imagining that because of reading book 1, I know this might sound a little bit odd, but I think book 1 will make book 2 better than book 2 would have been on its own. So I know that's kind of standard because we're having everything introduced and all the characters, the world, the events and so forth. But in book 2, we're going to have one of our main characters, Lidan, is going to be 16, 17 years old. She's going to be potentially the chief or the heir of her clan. She's potentially going to be, I guess, a kick-ass warrior woman. And that's maybe a little bit kind of samey. We've seen that in various places, and it's a kind of trope, if you want to call it so. It's a trope that I do quite enjoy if it's done well. But here, through reading Blood of Heirs first, we see the development, starting with Lidan as a 12-year-old. She's 13 at the end of the book, and you can see her growing into that role. And I think that would really enrich the character that we will see in book 2. So I'm really looking forward to it in that respect. In terms of the story itself, I did think there were some really exciting elements to it. I'm not going to go into it in detail because of the spoilers, but some of Rand's storyline and the things that he sees and does, I was really enjoying when I came across those. Lidan's story is a very different setting, and it's very much a change of pace as well, but I was still engrossed in her storyline and seeing her grow and the way that her clan sees her as she is growing. So in terms of the book overall, I really did enjoy it, although I felt that it was maybe a bit on the short side. It's about 350 pages in the Kindle version that I read at least, and I felt that it could have been longer, if nothing else because I felt that the story was kind of just really getting exciting at the point it was coming towards its close. So I guess I wasn't really ready for the story to end yet. But that's part of the reason why I'm really excited to read book 2, because I want to see what happens next and where our characters have gone and how they have developed in the meantime. So I'm hoping that book 2 is going to be really good and I'm going to enjoy it and move straight on essentially to book 3 in the series. Overall, because of some of those points, I felt that Blood of Heirs was a good read, but it was just a little bit lacking in some areas. So my overall rating was 3.5 stars. Now, in terms of my weighted ratings, where I'll go into some of those elements in a little bit more detail, my overall enjoyment was 15 out of 20. And this is because I felt that it just took a little bit of time to get going. And then by the time I'd finished with the book, it kind of felt like it was half a book rather than a complete book. Just because of the way that it ended, as I say, just as I was really starting to get properly engrossed in it and wanting more and more, and then the book ended. The world building, I gave 16 out of 20 because I was really happy with the way that the world looked. And I actually quite liked that we see the two different parts of the world and we don't actually have that combination of the two. We don't have the two plot lines converging in this particular book. It's different, but I like the way that it was worked. And I didn't feel that the book was any less for not having those storylines converging as well. The characters were 14, purely because we deal with two main characters and we've got various side characters, but we don't see nearly as much of those. I really did enjoy the two characters that we had, Ran and Lidan, and some of the side characters that we had as well, especially towards the second part of the book, I was definitely on board with as well. But there's definite room for improvement and for introducing more characters and for getting properly into those characters, as well as the development for book 2 of our two main characters. Plot, I gave 13 out of 20 because I thought it was a little bit basic in some aspects, and certainly for one of our storylines I felt that it didn't really get moving properly until kind of halfway through the book. So I did enjoy it overall, but I wanted maybe a little bit more at the start of it, and of course I wanted it to carry on when it came to a close as well. Writing style then was 7 out of 10, really easy reading, really accessible, no problems there for me. Pacing was 3 out of 5 because I felt that it was a little bit slower in some parts, but overall I didn't feel like the book was too fast or too slow paced, so it's a nice middle of the road score there for me. And in my discretionary category, I've given 2 out of 5. I really like the cover of this, and that's always one of the things that I look for in this category. In fact, the covers for all 3 of the books in the series I really quite like. And with this one, you've got a nice map as well, which is hand-drawn by the author, which is an extra little tick box to have as well. So overall, that gives us 70%, which if my gut feeling score was 3.5, that comes out as 70, so they tie in quite nicely there. In my long list of titles that I've reviewed using this scheme, that puts Blood of Heirs by Alicia Wanstall-Burke in equal 53rd place. So overall, a really enjoyable read. I definitely enjoyed this, even if the 3.5 stars or the 70% or equal 53rd don't sound too high. There are a lot of books that I've reviewed using this weighted scale, so the numbers maybe don't really mean quite that much unless you're in sort of the top 20 or so, in which case it is an absolutely fantastic book, or if you're getting towards the hundreds, for instance, in which case maybe you're not one of my favourites. So there we have Alicia Wanstall-Burke's Blood of Heirs, book 1 in the Coraidic Sagas. I will be reading book 2, Legacy of Ghosts, some point soon. I might read it in November or December so that I'm ready for book 3 when that one comes out towards the end of January. In the comments below, let me know your thoughts. Have you heard of this title? Is it one that you're interested in? Have I helped to bring this to your attention or to put it on your TBR for future reading? Also in the comments, because I'm going to be looking in this series at underrated books or books that I feel are under the radar, they're not really represented on BookTube. Drop me some notes if you've got some examples of titles you think that I might enjoy, typically looking at epic fantasy, maybe a bit of sci-fi. But if you've got books that you feel fit the bill and tick all of those boxes, let me know and I'll consider taking a look at those as well. As usual though, give this video a thumbs up if you liked what you've seen today, hit subscribe whilst you're down there. I'll see you in another video soon, but until then, take care of yourselves, read some good books. Bye.